very much older than the other. So Norik would have supposed, if not for the blade thrust into the other corpse's torso. Still, the deaths of 2 men long, long ago had little bearing on present circumstances. "Faustin, do you sense anything? Is there some sort of trap here?" The gaunt figure held his staff before the chamber for a moment, then lowered it again, his disgust quite evident. "There are too many conflicting forces in here, Norik. I can get no accurate sense of what to seek. I sense nothing directly dangerous, yet." To the side, Satan fairly hopped about in impatience. "So, do we leave all of this, leave all our dreams, or do we take a little risk and gather ourselves a few empires worth of coin?" Norik and the sorcerer exchanged glances. Neither could see any reason not to continue, especially with so many enticements before them. The veteran warrior finally settled the matter by taking a few steps further into the master chamber. When no great bolt of lightning nor demonic creatures struck him down, Satan and the Vigerai quickly followed suit. "There must be a couple dozen at least." Satan leapt over 2 skeletal corpses still trapped in struggle. "And that's not counting the ones in little pieces." "Satan, shut your mouth or I'll do it for you." Now that he actually walked among them, Norik wanted no more discussion concerning the dead treasure hunters. It still bothered him that so many had clearly died violently. Surely someone had survived. But if so, why did the coins and other treasure look virtually untouched? And then something else tore his thoughts from those questions. The sudden realization that beyond the treasure, at the very far end of the chamber, a dais stood atop a naturally formed set of steps. More important, atop that dais lay mortal remains still clad in armor. "Faustin!" Once the mage had come to his side, Norik pointed to the dais and muttered, "What do you make of that?" Faustin's only reply was to purse his thin lips and carefully make his way toward the platform. Norik followed close behind. "It would explain so much," he heard the Vigerai whisper. "It would explain so many conflicting magical signatures and so many signs of power." "What are you talking about?" The sorcerer finally looked back at him. "Come closer and see for yourself." Norik did just that. The sense of unease that had earlier filled him now amplified as the veteran peered at the macabre display atop the platform. He had been a man of military aspirations, that much Norik could at least tell, even if of the garments only a few tattered remains existed. The fine leather boots lay tipped to each side, pieces of the pants sticking out of them. What likely had once been a silk shirt could barely be seen under the majestic breastplate lying askew on the rib cage. Underneath that, blackened bits of a formerly regal robe covered much of the upper half of the platform. Well-crafted gauntlets and gutter-shaped plates, vambraces, gave the illusion of arms still sinewy and flesh-bound, whereas other plates, these overlapping, did the same for the shoulders. Less successful was the armor on the legs, which, along with the bones there, lay askew, as if something had disturbed them at some point. "Do you see it?" Faustin asked. Not certain what exactly he meant, Norik squinted. Other than the fact that the armor itself seemed colored an unsettling yet familiar shade of red, he could see nothing that would have... No head. The body on the dais had no head. Norik glanced past the dais, saw no trace on the floor. He made mention of that to the sorcerer. "Yes, it is exactly as described." The lanky figure swept toward the platform, almost too eager in the veteran's mind. Faustin stretched out a hand but held back at the very last moment from touching what lay upon it. The body placed with the top to the north, the head and helm separated already in battle, now separated in time and distance in order to ensure an absolute end to the matter. The marks of power set into the walls, there to counter and contain the darkness still within the corpse. But... Faustin's voice trailed off as he continued to stare. "But what?" The mage shook his head. Nothing, I suppose. Perhaps just being so near to him unsettles my nerves more than I like to admit." By now, somewhat exasperated with Faustin's murky words, Norik gritted his teeth. "So, who is he? Some prince?" "By heaven, no. Do you not see?" One gloved finger pointed at the red breastplate. "This is the lost tomb of Bartok, Lord of Demons, Master of darkest sorcery. The Warlord of Blood." The words escaped Norik as little more than a gasp. He knew very well the tales of Bartok, who had risen among the ranks of sorcerers, only to later turn to the darkness, to the demons. Now the redness of the armor made perfect and horrible sense. It was the color of human blood. In his madness, Bartok, who even the demons who had first seduced him had eventually come to fear, had bathed himself before each battle in the blood of previously fallen foes. His armor, once brilliant gold, had become forever stained by his sinful acts. He had razed cities to the ground, committed atrocities unbounded, and would have continued on forever, so the stories went, if not for the desperate acts of his own brother, Horazan, and other Viserai sorcerers, who had used what knowledge they retained of the ancient, more natural magics to defeat the fiend. Bartok and his demon host had been slaughtered just short of victory, the warlord himself decapitated, just in the midst of casting a dire counterspell. Still untrusting of his brother's vast power even in death, Horazan had commanded that Bartok's body forever be hidden from the sight of men. Why they had not simply burned it, Norik did not know, but certainly he would have tried. Regardless, rumors had arisen shortly thereafter of places where the Warlord of Blood had been laid to rest. Many had sought out his tomb, especially those of the black arts, interested in possible lingering magic, but no one had ever claimed to truly find it. The Viserai likely knew more detail than Norik, but the veteran fighter understood all too well what they had found. Legend had it that for a time Bartok had lived among Norik's own people, that perhaps some of those with whom the soldier had grown up had been, in fact, descendants of the monstrous despot's followers. Yes, Norik knew very well the legacy of the warlord. He shuddered and, without thinking, began to back away from the dais. "Faustin, we're leaving this place." "But surely, my friend, we're leaving." The cowled figure studied Norik's eyes, then nodded. "Perhaps you are right." Grateful, Norik turned to his other companion. "Satan, forget everything. We're leaving here, now." Something near the shadowed mouth of the chamber caught his attention, something that moved, and that was not Satan Trist. The third member of the party presently engaged himself in trying to fill a sack with every manner of jewel he could find. "Satan!" snapped the older fighter. "Drop the sack, quick!" The thing near the entrance shuffled forward. "Are you mad?" Satan called, not even bothering to look over his shoulder. "This is all we've dreamed about." A clatter of movement caught Norik's attention, a clatter of movement from more than one direction. He swallowed as the original figure moved better into view. The empty sockets of the mummified warrior they had first stepped over greeted his own terrified gaze. "Satan, look to your back!" Now, at last, he had his partner's attention. The wiry soldier dropped the sack instantly, whirling about and pulling his blade free. However, when he saw what both Norik and Faustin already faced, Satan Trist's countenance turned as pale as bone. One by one, they began to rise, from corpse to skeleton, those who had preceded the trio to this tomb. Now Norik understood why no one had ever left alive, and why he and his friends might soon be added to the grisly ranks. "Kozarak!" One of the skeletons nearest to the sorcerer vanished in a burst of orange flame. Faustin pointed a finger at another, a half-clad ghoul with some traces of his former face still remaining. The Viserai repeated the word of power. Nothing happened. "My spell." Stunned, Faustin failed to notice another skeleton on his left, now raising a rusted but still serviceable sword, and clearly intending to sever the mage's head from his body. "Watch it!" Norik deflected the blow, then thrust. Unfortunately, his attack did nothing, the blade simply passing through the rib cage. In desperation, he kicked at his horrific foe, sending the skeleton crashing into another of the shambling undead. They were outnumbered several times over by foes who could not be slain by normal means. Norik saw Satan, cut off from his two friends, leap to the top of a mound of coins and try to defend himself from two nightmarish warriors, one a cadaverous husk, the other a partial skeleton with one good arm. Several more closed in from behind those two. "Faustin, can you do anything?" "I am trying a different spell." Again, the Viserai called out a word. This time, the two creatures battling with Satan froze in place. Not one to miss such an opportunity, Trist swung at the pair with all his might. Both ghouls shattered into countless pieces, their entire top halves scattered on the stone floor. "Your powers are back!" Norik's hopes rose. "They never left me. I fear I have only one chance to use each spell, and most of those still remaining take much time to cast." Norik had no chance to comment on the terrible news, for his own situation had grown even more desperate. He traded quick strikes with first one, then two of the encroaching ranks of undead. The ghouls seemed slow in reaction, for which he gave some thanks, but numbers and perseverance would eventually pay off for these ghastly guardians of the warlord's tomb. Those who had planned this last trap had planned well, for each party that entered added to the ranks that would attack the next. Norik could imagine where the first undead had come from. He had remarked to his friends early on that although the three had come across sprung traps and dead creatures, no bodies had been found until the skull with the spike in its head. The first party to discover Bartik's tomb surely had lost some of its numbers on the trek inside, never knowing that those dead comrades would become the survivors' greatest nightmare. And so, with each new group, the ranks of guardians had grown, with Norik, Satan, and Faustin now set to be added. One of the mummified corpses cut at Norik's left arm. The veteran used the torch in his other hand to ignite the dry flesh, turning the zombie into a walking inferno. Risking his foot, Norik kicked the fiery creature into its comrade. Despite that success, though, the horde of unliving continued to press all three back. "Norik!" shouted Satan from somewhere. "Faustin! They're coming at me from everywhere!" Neither could help him, though, both as harried. The mage beat off one skeleton with his staff, but two more quickly filled in the space left. The creatures had begun to move with more fluidity and greater swiftness. Soon, no advantage whatsoever would remain for Norik and his friends. Separating him from Faustin, three ghoulish warriors pressed Norik Viseran up the steps, and finally against the dais. The bones of the warlord of blood rattled in the armor, but much to the hard-pressed veteran's relief, Bartik did not rise to command this infernal army. A flash of smoke alerted him to the fact that the sorcerer had managed to deal with yet another of the undead. But Norik knew that Faustin could not handle all of them. So far, neither of the fighters had managed much more than a momentary stalemate. Without flesh for their blades to penetrate, without vital organs that could be skewered, knives and swords meant nothing. The thought of one day
We're definitely on the lookout for breakthrough shows. So, what do you got?
I want to reboot the old sitcom Step Right Up.
Step right up.
Step right. Are you serious?
And I want to do it with the original cast.
According to Wikipedia, Clay Barber, drug charge and disorderly conduct. Bray Marie Jensen did a low-budget sci-fi cable show.
Captain, I'll repair them as soon as I...
rising as one of these and moving to slay the next hapless intruders sent a shiver down Norik's spine. He moved along the side of the dais as best he could, trying to find some path by which to escape. To his shame, Norik knew that he would have happily abandoned his comrades if an opening to freedom had abruptly materialized. His strength flagged. A blade caught him in the thigh. The pain not only made him cry out, but caused Norik to lose his grip on his sword. The weapon clattered down the steps, disappearing behind the encroaching ghouls. His leg nearly buckling, Norik waved the torch at the oncoming attackers with one hand, while his other sought some hold on the platform. However, instead of stone, his grasping fingers took hold of cold metal that offered no support whatsoever. His wounded leg finally gave out. Norik slipped to one knee, pulling the metallic object he had accidentally grabbed with him. The torch flew away. A sea of grotesque faces filled the warrior's horrified view as Norik attempted to right himself. The desperate treasure hunter raised the hand with which he had tried to garner some hold, as if by silently beseeching the undead for mercy, he could forestall the inevitable. Only at the last did he realize that the hand he had raised now had somehow become clad in metal. A gauntlet. The very same gauntlet that he earlier had seen on the skeleton of Bartek. Even as this startling discovery registered in his mind, a word that Norik did not understand ripped forth from his mouth, echoing throughout the chamber. The jeweled patterns in the walls flared bright, brighter, and the unearthly foes of the trio froze in place. Another word, this one even less intelligible, burst free from the stunned veteran. The patterns of power grew blinding, burning, and exploded. A fearsome wave of pure energy tore through the chamber, coursing over the undead. Shards flew everywhere, forcing Norik to fold himself into as small a bundle as possible. He prayed that the end would be relatively quick and painless. The magic consumed the undead where they stood. Bones and dried flesh burned as readily as oiled tinder. Their weapons melted, creating piles of slag and ash. Yet, it did not touch any of the party. "What's happening? What's happening?" he heard Satan cry. The inferno moved with acute precision, sweeping over the tomb's guardians, but nothing else. As their numbers dwindled, so too did the intensity of the force, until at last neither remained. The chamber became plunged into near darkness, the only illumination now the two torches and the little bit of light reflected by the many ruined stones. Norik gaped at the devastating results, wondering what he had just wrought, and whether it somehow heralded an even more terrible situation. He then stared down at the gauntlet, afraid to leave it on, but equally fearful of what might happen if he tried to remove it. They have all been devoured," Faustin managed, the Viserai forcing himself to his feet. His robe had been cut in many places, and the thin mage held one arm where blood still flowed from a nasty wound. Satan hopped down from where he had been battling. Remarkably, he looked entirely uninjured. But how? How, indeed? Norik flexed his gloved fingers. The metal felt almost like a second skin, far more comfortable than he could have thought possible. Some of the fear faded as the possibilities of what else he might be able to do became more obvious. "Norik," came Faustin's voice, "when did you put that on?" He paid no attention, instead thinking that it might be interesting to try the other gauntlet. Better yet, the entire suit, and see how it felt. As a young recruit, he had once dreamed of rising to the rank of general and garnering his riches through victory in battle. Now that old, long-faded dream seemed fresh and, for the first time, so very possible. A shadow loomed over his hand. He looked up to see the sorcerer eyeing him in concern. "Norik, my friend, perhaps you should take off that glove." Take it off? Suddenly, the notion of doing so made absolutely no sense to the soldier. The gauntlet had been the only thing that had saved their lives. Why take it off? Could it be that the Viserai simply coveted it for himself? In things magic, Faustin's kind knew no loyalty. If Norik did not give him the gauntlet, the odds were that Faustin might simply just take it when his comrade could not stop him. A part of the veteran's mind tried to dismiss the hateful notions. Faustin had saved his life more than once. He and Satan were Norik's best, and only, friends. The Eastern mage would certainly not try something so base. Would he? Norik, listen to me. An edge of emotion, perhaps envy, perhaps fear, touched the other's voice. It is vital right now that you take that gauntlet off. We shall put it back on the platform. What is it? Satan called. What's wrong with him, Faustin? Norik became convinced that he had been right the first time. The sorcerer wanted his glove. Satan, ready your blade. We may have to... My blade? You want me to use it on Norik? Something within the older fighter took control. Norik watched, as if from a distance, as the gauntleted hand darted out and caught the Viserai by the throat. Satan, his wrist, cut at his... Out of the corner of his eye, Norik saw his other companion hesitate, then raise his weapon to attack. A fury, such as he had never experienced, consumed the veteran. The world grew to a bloody red, then turned to utter blackness. And in that blackness, Norik Viseran heard screams. 2. In the land of Aranok, at the very northern fringe of the vast, oppressive desert which made up much of that land, the small but resolute army of General Augustus Malevolent remained encamped. They had set up camp some weeks previous for reasons that still mystified most of the soldiers, but no one dared question the decisions of the general. Most of these men had followed Malevolent since his early days in Westmarch, and their fanaticism to his cause remained without question. But in silence, they wondered why he seemed unwilling to move on. Many felt certain that it had to do with the more gaudy tent pitched not far from the commander's own, the tent belonging to the witch. Each morning, Malevolent went to her, evidently seeking portents of the future and making his decisions based upon those. In addition, each evening, Galiona made her way to the general's tent for more personal matters. How much influence she had over his choices, none could truly say, but it had to be substantial. And as the morning sun began to peek over the horizon, the slim, well-groomed figure of Augustus Malevolent emerged from his quarters, his pale, clean-shaven features, once described by a now deceased rival as the very visage of Lord Death without the kindness inherent. Entirely without expression, Malevolent stood clad in armor of the darkest ebony, save for the crimson border running along every edge, especially around the neck. In addition, the symbol of a red fox over 3 silver swords decorated the breastplate, the only reminder of the general's far-flung past. 2 aides attended the general as he put on ebony and crimson gauntlets that looked as if they had just been forged. In fact, Malevolent's entire suit looked to be in perfect condition, the result of nightly cleanings by soldiers trained to understand what even a single hint of rust might mean to their lives. Fully covered, save for his head, Malevolent marched directly toward the sanctum of his sorceress, his mistress. Resembling something of a tent-maker's nightmare, the abode of Galiona looked as if it had been put together like a quilt, with patches of more than 24 shades of color sewn together over and over. Only those like the general, who saw beyond the facade, might have noticed that the various colors created specific patterns, and only those cognizant of the inner workings of sorcery would have known the power inherent in those patterns. Behind Malevolent, the 2 aides followed, in the arms of one a covered burden that vaguely resembled something akin in shape to a head. The officer carrying the object moved uneasily, as if what he held filled him with distrust, and not a little fear. The commander did not bother to announce himself, yet just as he reached the closed flap of the witch's tent, a feminine voice, both deep and taunting, bid him enter. Even though sunlight now toyed with the encampment, the interior of Galiona's tent appeared so dark that if not for the single oil lamp dangling from the middle of the ceiling, the general and his aides would not have been able to see more than a foot beyond their noses. Had that been so, they would have missed quite a sight indeed. Pouches and flasks and items unnamed hung everywhere. Although once offered a case in which to house her wares, the sorceress had declined, finding some purpose in hanging each piece by noose in carefully pre-selected locations. General Malevolent did not question this idiosyncrasy. So long as he received his desired answers, Galiona could have hung dry corpses from the ceiling, and he would have made no comment. She nearly did just that. While many of her prizes remained thankfully hidden within containers, those that dangled free included the desiccated forms of several rare creatures and various components of others. In addition, there were a few items that looked to have come from human sources, although full identification would have required too close an inspection. To further add to the uneasiness her sanctum engendered in all save her commander and lover, the single lamp somehow created shadows that did not move in conjunction with normal reasoning. Ofttimes, Malevolent's men would see the flame flicker in one direction, but a shadow move in another. The shadows in general also made the tent seem much larger inside than its outer dimensions warranted, as if by stepping in, the newcomers had entered a place not entirely set in the mortal plane. And as the centerpiece to this unsettling and distracting chamber, the sorceress Galiona presented the most arresting and yet also disturbing vision of all. As she rose from the multicolored pillows covering the patterned carpet below, a fire stirred within each man. Lush, cascading black hair fell back to reveal a round, enticing countenance marked by full red and inviting lips, a generous but pleasing nose, and deep, so very deep, green eyes, matched only by the sharp emerald ones of the general himself. Thick lashes half draped over those eyes, as the witch seemed to devour each newcomer in turn, simply by looking at him. "My general," she purred, each word a promise. Built voluptuously, Galiona displayed her assets as she did every weapon at her command. Her gown had been purposely cut as low as it could go, without failing its most basic function, and glittering jewels accented the edges near her chest. When she moved as if the wind gently pushed her along, her thin garments billowing seductively around her. The visible effect of her charms on Malevolent proved to be little more than a slight touch of his gloved hand on her deep brown cheek, which the sorceress accepted as if he caressed her with the softest fur. She smiled, revealing teeth perfect, save that they had a slight cat-like sharpness to them. "Galiona, my Galiona, slept you well?" "When I actually slept, my general." He chuckled. "Yes, the same myself." His very slight smile faded abruptly. "Until I had the dream." "Dream?" The momentary intake of breath before she spoke signaled well enough that Galiona took this comment not at all lightly. "Yes." He moved past her, staring at, without actually seeing, one of the more macabre pieces of her collection. He toyed with it, moved one of the joints while he spoke. "The warlord of blood arisen." She swept over to him, a dark angel now at his shoulder, her eyes wide with anticipation. "Tell me all, my general, tell me all." "I saw the armor without the man struggle from the grave. Then bone filled the armor, with muscle and tendon joining afterward. Then flesh covered the body, but it was not Bartok as his images have shown." The ebony-clad officer seemed disappointed. "A rather mundane face, if anything, but artisans were never known for carvings such as those. Perhaps this was the face of the warlord, although he seemed more a frightened soul in my dream." "Is that it?" "No. I saw blood then, on his face, and after it appeared he marched off. I saw mountains give way to hills and hills to sand, and then I saw him sink into that sand. And there the dream ended." One of the other officers caught sight of a shadow in one far corner of the tent. It moved, shifting toward the general. Trained by experience not to speak of such things, he swallowed and held his tongue, hoping that the shadow would not, at some later point, turn in his own direction. Galiona draped herself against General Malevolin's breastplate, looking up into his eyes. "Have you ever had this dream before, my general?" "You would have known." "Yes, I would have. You know how important it is to tell me everything." She separated from him, returning to the pile of plush pillows. A glimmer of sweat covered every revealed portion of her body. "And this, most important of all. For this is no ordinary dream. No, it is not." "I suspected as much myself." He waved one negligent hand toward the aide, who carried the cloth-covered object. The man stepped forward, at the same time ripping away the material in order to reveal what lay beneath. A helmet with a ridged crest glistened in the weak light of the single lamp. Old, but intact, it would have covered most of the head and visage of its wearer, leaving but two narrowed gaps for the eyes, a slight passage for the nose, and a wider but still narrow horizontal gash for the mouth. The back of the helmet hung low, protecting the neck there, but leaving the throat itself completely open. Even in the dim illumination, one could clearly discern that the helmet had been colored blood red. "I thought you might need Bartok's helm." "You may be right." Galiona separated herself from Malevolin, reaching out for the artifact. Her fingers brushed the aide's own, and the man shivered. With the general facing away from her, and the second officer unable to see from his angle, the sorceress took the opportunity to let one hand briefly caress the aide's wrist. She had tasted him once or twice when her appetite had demanded some change of pace, but knew that he would never dare tell his commander of their encounters. Malevolin would be more likely to have him executed rather than his valued witch. She took the helmet and placed it on the ground near where she had originally been sitting. The general dismissed his men, then joined Galiona there, placing himself directly across from her. "Do not fail me, my dear. I am adamant in this." For the first time, a bit of Galiona's confidence dissipated. Augustus had always been a man of his word, especially when it came to the fates of those who did not live up to his expectations. Hiding her concern, the dark sorceress placed her hands palm down on the top of the helmet. The general removed his gauntlets and did the same. The flame in the lamp flickered, seemed to shrink to nearly nothing. The shadows spread, thickened, and yet somehow also seemed more alive, more independent of the frail light. That they had a surreal, unworldly sense to them did not bother General Malevolin in the least, though. He knew of some of the powers with which Galiona conversed and suspected others. As a military man with imperial ambitions, he saw all as useful tools to his cause. Like calls to like, blood to blood. The words slipped readily from Galiona's full lips. She had uttered this litany many times for her patron. Let that which was his call to that which was his. What the shadow of Bartok wore must be linked again. Malevolin felt his pulse quicken. The world seemed to pull back from him. Galiona's words echoed, became the only focus. At first, he saw nothing but an eternal gray. Then, before his eyes, an image coalesced in the grayness, an image somewhat familiar to him. He saw again Bartok's armor, and the fact that someone wore it now. But this time the general grew certain that the man before him could not possibly be the legendary warlord. "Who?" he hissed. "Who?" Galiona did not answer him. Her eyes closed, her head bent back in concentration. A shadow moved behind her, one that Malevolin vaguely thought resembled some large insect. Then, as the image before him grew, he threw his attention wholly back into identifying and locating this stranger. "A warrior," the sorceress murmured. "A man of many campaigns." "Forget that. Where is he? Is he close?" The warlord's armor, after so very long, so many false trails. She twitched from effort. Malevolent did not care, willing to push her to the very limits and beyond, if necessary. Mountains. Cold, chill peaks. No help there. The world was filled with mountains, especially the north and across the twin seas. Even Westmarch had its share. Galiona shuddered twice. Blood calls to blood. He gritted his teeth. Why repeat herself? Blood calls to blood. She teetered, nearly losing her grip on the helmet. Her link to the spell all but broke. Malevolent did his best to maintain the vision on his own, even though his own magical skills paled in comparison to Galiona's. Yet, for a moment, he managed to fix better on that face. Simple, nothing at all like a leader. In some ways, panic-stricken. Not cowardly, but clearly far out of his element. The image began to falter. The general silently swore. The armor had been found by some damn foot soldier or deserter who likely had no idea of either its value or its power. Where is he? The vision faded away with such abruptness that it startled even him. At the same time, the dark witch let out a gasp and fell back onto the many pillows, completely shattering the spell. A tremendous force threw Malevolent's hands from the helmet. A string of harsh epithets burst from the general's mouth. With a moan, Galiona slowly rose to a sitting position. She held her head with one hand as she looked at Malevolent. He, in turn, considered whether or not to have her whipped. To entice him with the fact that the armor had been found, and then to leave him without the knowledge of where it was. She read his dark look, and what it likely meant for her. I haven't failed you, my general. After all this time, Bardac's legacy is yours to fulfill. Fulfill? Malevolent rose, barely able to keep his frustration and fury in check. Fulfill? Bardac commanded demons. He spread his power over much of the world. The pale commander gestured at the helmet. I bought that from the peddler as a memento, a symbol of the might I sought to gain. A false artifact, I thought, but well done. The helmet of Bardac. The general let out a harsh laugh. Only when I put it on did I realize the truth, that it was the helmet. Yes, my general. Galiona quickly rose and put her hands on his chest, her fingers caressing the metal as if it were his own flesh. And you began to have the dreams, the visions of Bardac. I've seen his victories, seen his glories, seen his strength. I've lived them all. Malevolent's tone grew increasingly bitter, but only in my dreams. It was fate that brought the helmet to you. Fate and the spirit of Bardac, don't you see? He means for you to be his successor. Trust me. The witch cooed. There can be no reason, for you're the only one to see these visions without my aid. True. After the first two incidents, each during a period in which Malevolent had worn the helmet, the general had commanded a few of his most trusted officers to try the artifact on for themselves. Even those who had worn it for several hours had admitted to no subsequent dreams of their own. That, to Augustus Malevolent, had been proof enough that he had been chosen by the spirit of the warlord to take on his glorious mantle. Malevolent knew all that any mortal man could know of Bardac. He studied every document, researched every legend. While many in the past have shrunken away from the warlord's dark and demonic history, fearing some taint spreading to themselves, the general had devoured each scrap of information. He could match Bardac in strategy and physical strength, but Malevolent himself wielded only the least bit of magic, barely enough to light a candle. Galiona had provided him with more sorcery, not to mention other pleasures, but to truly be able to emulate the warlord's glory, Malevolent needed some manner by which to summon and command not one demon, but many. The armor would open that path for him. Of that he had become obsessively certain. Malevolent's extensive research had indicated that Bardac had imbued the suit with formidable enchantments. The general's own meager powers had already been augmented by the helmet. Surely the complete ensorcelled suit would give him what he desired. Surely the shade of Bartok wanted that. The visions had to be a sign. "There is one thing I can tell you, my general," the sorceress whispered. "One thing to encourage you in your quest." He seized her by her arms. "What? What is it?" She grimaced momentarily from the pain of his grip. "He, the fool who wears the armor now, he comes nearer." "To us?" "Perhaps, if the helmet and the rest are meant to be with one another. But even if not so, the closer he comes, the better I'll be able to specifically locate him." Galiona pulled one arm free, then touched Malevolin's chin. "You can wait just a little longer, my love. Just a little longer." Releasing her, the general considered. "You will check each morning and each evening. You will spare no effort. The moment you can identify where this cretin is located, I must know. We shall march immediately after. Nothing must stand between me and my destiny." He seized the helmet, and without another word departed from her tent, his aides quickly falling into line behind him. Malevolin's mind raced as he pictured himself in the ensorcelled armor. Demonic legions would rise to his command. Cities would fall. An empire spanning the world would spring up. Augustus Malevolin hugged the helmet almost protectively as he returned to his own quarters. Galiona had the right of it. He only had to be a little more patient. The armor would come to him. "I will do as you once dreamed of doing," he whispered to the absent shade of Bartok. "Your legacy will be my destiny." The general's eyes gleamed. "And soon." The witch shuddered as Malevolin vanished through the tent's flap. He had grown more unstable of late, especially the longer he wore the ancient helm. On one occasion she had even caught him speaking as if he were the warlord of blood himself. Galiona knew that the helmet, and likely all the armor, contained some mysterious magical force, but as of yet she had been able to neither identify nor control it. If she could control it, she would not need her lover any longer. A pity in some ways, but there were always other males, other more malleable males. A voice broke the silence, a scratchy, deep voice that even to the witch sounded something akin to the buzzing of 1,000 dying flies. "Patience is virtue. This one should know. 123 years on this mortal plane in search of the warlord. So long, and now it comes together." Galiona looked around at the shadows, searching for one in particular. She finally noticed it in a far corner of the tent, a wavering, insect-like figure, only visible to one who truly looked close. "Be silent. Someone may hear." "No one hears when this one chooses," the voice rasped. "Know you that well, human." "Then quiet your voice for my sanity, Zazax." The dark-skinned sorceress stared at the shadow, but did not approach it. Even after all this time, she did not entirely trust her constant companion. "So tender the ears of a human." The shadow took more form, now resembling a specific insect, a praying mantis. Yet such a mantis would have been more than 7 feet tall, if not more. "So soft and failing their bodies." "You'd do well not to talk of failures." A low, chittering noise spread throughout the tent. Galiona steeled herself, knowing that her companion did not like to be corrected. Zazax moved, shifting closer. "Tell this one of the vision shared." "You saw it?" but this one would hear it from you. Please, indulge this one. Very well. Taking a deep breath, she described in as good detail as she could the man and the armor. Zazax surely had seen everything, but for some reason the fool always made her go over the visions. Galiona tried to hurry matters by ignoring the man for the most part, going more into the armor itself and the landscape vaguely seen in the background. Zazax suddenly cut her off. This one knows that the armor is true. This one knows that it wanders this mortal plane. The human. What about the human? Perfectly ordinary. Nothing special about him. Nothing is ordinary. Describe. A soldier, plain of face, a simple fighter, probably the son of farmers from the looks of him. Nothing extraordinary. Some poor fool who stumbled onto the armor and, as the general clearly thinks, has no idea what it is. Again, the chittering. The shadow withdrew slightly. When Zazax spoke, he sounded extremely disappointed. Certain that this mortal journeys nearer. So it seems. The murky form grew still. Zazax clearly had something in mind. Galiona waited, and waited some more. Zazax had no concept of time where others were concerned, only when it came to his own needs and desires. 2 flashes of deep yellow momentarily appeared where the head of the shadow seemed to be. What might have been the outline of an appendage ending in 3 clawed digits shifted momentarily into sight, then quickly vanished again. Let him come, then. This one will have decided by then whether one puppet is better than another. Zazax's form grew indistinct. All semblance of a mantis, of any creature, faded away. Let him come. The shadow melted into the darkened corners. Galiona swore to herself. She had learned much from the foul creature, increased her power in so many ways because of his past guidance. Yet, much more than Augustus, she would have preferred disposing of Zazax, being rid of his horrid self. The general could be manipulated to a point, but not so her secret companion. With Zazax, the sorceress played a continual game of cat and mouse, and too often she felt like the latter of the 2 creatures. However, one did not simply break a pact with Zazax's kind. If done without precautions, Galiona might find herself minus her limbs and her head, all before he finally let her die. And that made her consider at last something new.
Download the Domino's app today and become a Piece of the Pie Rewards member to earn points toward free pizza.
He who wore Bardak's armor certainly looked to be a warrior, a fighter, and as she had also described him, a simple man, too. In other words, a fool. Galiona knew well how to manipulate such. As a man, he would be defenseless against her charms. As a fool, he would never realize that fact. She would have to see how matters went with both the general and Zazax. If it seemed one or the other still worked to her advantage, Galiona would do what she could to tip the balance that way. Malevolent, with the armor his to command, could certainly deal with her shadowy partner. However, if Zazax gained the ensorcelled artifacts first, truly he would be the one to follow. Still, the stranger remained a possibility. Certainly he could be led around by the nose, told what to do. He presented potential where the other 2 presented risk. Yes, Galiona intended to keep an eye on this fool for her own good. He would be far more susceptible to her desires than an ambitious and slightly mad military commander, and certainly far less dangerous than a demon. 3. Blood. By all that's holy, Norik, what have you done? Norik, my friend, perhaps you should take off that glove. Blood. Damn you! Damn you! Satan, his wrist, cut. Blood everywhere. Norik, for God's sake, my arm! Norik! Norik! The blood of those closest to him. No! Norik raised his head, screaming before he even knew he had awakened. A chill wind snapped him to full consciousness, and for the first time he noticed the intense pain in his right cheek. Without thinking much, he put a hand to that cheek. Cold metal brushed his skin. With a start, Norik looked at the hand. A hand clothed in a crimson gauntlet, a reddish liquid now staining the fingertips. Blood. With great trepidation, he returned his hand to his cheek, touching the flesh with one finger now. By that means, Norik discovered that he bled in 3 places. 3 valleys had been gouged in his cheek, as if some animal had clawed him. Norik! A flash of memory sent shivers through the veteran. Satan's face, contorted in fear not witnessed by Norik outside of the most horrible field of battle. Satan's eyes pleading, his mouth open, but no more words escaping. Satan's hand tearing desperately at his friend's face. No. It could not be as Norik remembered it. Another image. Faustin on the floor of the tomb, blood pooling on the stones nearby. Its source, the gaping hole where the Vigeri's throat had once been. The sorcerer, at least, had died relatively quickly. No, no, no. Growing more horrified by the moment, the half-mad soldier struggled to his feet. Around him he noticed tall hills, even mountains, and the first glimmers of sunlight. Yet none of them looked at all familiar. None of them at all resembled the peak in which he and his friends had discovered the tomb of Bardock. Norik took a step forward, trying to get his bearings. An unsettling creaking accompanied every motion. Norik looked down to discover that not only his hands were clad in metal. Armor. Everywhere he stared, Norik only saw the same blood-colored metal plates. He had thought that his shock and horror could not possibly grow worse, but simply gazing at the rest of his body nearly threw the formerly steady soldier into complete panic. His arms, his torso, his legs, the same crimson armor now hid all. To add to the mockery, Norik saw that he even wore Bardock's ancient but still serviceable leather boots. Bardock, warlord of blood. Bardock, whose dark magic had apparently saved the helpless soldier at the price of Satan and the sorcerer's lives. Damn you! Gazing down at his hands again, Norik tore at the gauntlets. He tugged as hard as he could on first the left, then the right. Yet, regardless of which Norik sought to remove, the metal gloves slid no more than an inch before seeming to catch. He peered within, and after seeing no impediment, tried once more, but still the gauntlets would not come off. Worse, as the sun rose, for the first time Norik could see that the blood from his injured cheek had not been the only stains upon the metal. Each finger, even most of each palm, looked as if it had been bathed in a rich red dye. But it was not dye that covered them. Faustin, he murmured. Satan. With a roar of outrage, Norik swung one fist at the nearest rocks, perfectly willing to break every bone in his hand, if only it would mean the release of his hand. Instead, though, the rock itself gave way in part, the only damage to Norik being a violent throbbing throughout his entire arm. He dropped to his knees. No! The wind howled, seeming to mock him. Norik remained where he was, head cast down, arms dangling. Fragments of what had happened in the tomb flashed through his mind, each painting a scene most diabolic. Satan and Faustin, both dead by his hands. Norik's head jerked up again. Not exactly by his hands. The damned gauntlets, one of which had saved him from the ghoulish sentinels, had done this. Norik still blamed himself much for those deaths, for perhaps he might have altered matters if he had removed the first gauntlet immediately, but by himself he would have never slaughtered his friends. There had to be a way to remove the gloves, even if he had to peel them off piece by piece, taking some of his skin off with the metal. Determined to do something for himself, the veteran fighter rose again, trying to better identify his surroundings. Unfortunately, he saw little more now than he had on first glance. Mountains and hills. Forest stretching to the north. No sign of habitation, not even a distant plume of smoke. And again, nothing resembling the peak in which Bartek's tomb lay. Where in hell? He broke off quickly, uneasy at even mentioning that dark and supposedly mythic realm. Even as a child, and certainly as a soldier, Norik had never believed much in either demons or angels, but the horror to which he had been a part had changed some of his opinions. Whether or not demons and angels truly existed, the warlord of blood had certainly left a monstrous legacy, a legacy of which Norik hoped to rid himself quickly. Hoping that perhaps he had simply been too upset the first time he had tried to remove the gauntlets, Norik decided to inspect them in yet greater detail. However, as he looked down, he made yet another horrific discovery. Not only did blood soil the gloves, but it did so the breastplate, too. Worse, on closer study, Norik saw that the blood had not accidentally splattered the armor, but had been purposively and methodically spread across it. Again, he shuddered. Quickly returning to the gauntlets, he sought some latch, some catch, even some dent that might have caused the gloves to stick. Nothing. Nothing held the gauntlets fast. By rights, they should have slid off his hands with a simple shake toward the ground. The armor. If he could not remove the gauntlets, surely he could unfasten the other pieces. Some had catches, readily seen, and even with the gauntlets he surely would not have that much trouble undoing them. Other pieces would not have any catches, having been simply designed to slide on and off. Bending down, Norik tried one leg. He fumbled at the catches at first, then saw how best to secure his hold. With great care, the soldier forced the catch open. And immediately, it snapped shut. He forced it open again, only to have the same result. Norik cursed, attempting the catch a third time. This time, it would not even open. Attempting several others resulted in the same frustrating results. Worse, when he tried to at least remove the boots, that despite the cold, they, like the gauntlets, slid only so far before refusing to give way. This can't be possible. Norik tugged harder, but again with no visible success. Madness! These were only garments, pieces of metal, and a pair of old if sturdy boots. They had to come off. Norik's desperation rose. He was a common man, a man who believed that the sun rose in the morning and the moon at night. Birds flew and fish swam. People wore clothes, but clothes never wore people. He glared at the bloody palms. What do you want of me? What do you want? No sepulchral voice arose from around him, telling him of his dark fate. The gauntlets did not suddenly draw words or symbols in the earth. The armor simply would not let go of its new wearer. Scattered images of his companions' gruesome ends once more tumbled about in his thoughts, making it hard for Norik to focus. Norik prayed, pleaded for them to go away, but suspected that they would forever torment him. Yet, if he could never be rid of the nightmares, there still might be something he could do about the cursed suit he wore. Faustin had been a sorcerer of some reputation, but even the Vigerai had admitted that there were many practitioners more skilled, more knowledgeable than he. Norik would just have to find one of them. He looked east, then west. To the east he saw nothing but tall and menacing mountains, whereas the west seemed a bit more gentle in scope. True, Norik knew he might be working under false assumptions, but his best hope, he decided, had to be the latter direction. The cold wind and moisture already chilling him to the bone, the weary veteran started off on his tremendous trek. It might be that he would die of exposure before he even made it out of the mountains, but some part of him suspected that such would not be so. Bartek's armor had not seized him simply to let him die in the middle of the wilderness. No, it likely had some other notion in mind, one that would make itself known with time. Norik did not look forward to that revelation at all. The sun vanished into an overcast sky, turning the weather even colder. A wetness also hung in the air. Breathing heavily, Norik pushed on despite everything. As of yet, he had not so much as seen a glimpse to hint that he traveled the right direction. For all the weary veteran knew, he had headed in the exact opposite of where he should have gone. Some mountain kingdom could have been just past the next peak to the east. Thoughts like that, however frustrating, managed to keep Norik from completely going mad. Each time he let his thoughts wander, they ever returned to the tomb and the horror of which he had been a part. Faustin's and Satan's faces haunted him, and every now and then Norik imagined he saw the pair condemning him from this shadow or that. But they were dead, and unlike the bloody warlord, they would stay so. Only Norik's guilt continued to condemn him. Around midday, he began to stumble. It finally occurred to him that he had neither eaten nor drunk since waking, and the day before he had last supped early. Unless he planned to fall over soon and die, Norik had to find sustenance of some sort. But how? He had no weapon, no trap. Water he could find simply by scooping up some of the snow topping the nearby rocks, but actual food looked to be hard to come by. Deciding he could at least assuage his thirst, Norik walked over to a small outcropping where the coolness of the shadows had kept a small bit of snow and ice still unmelted. He scooped up what he could and greedily sucked on it, not caring at all about the bits of dust and grass that came with it. In moments, his head seemed to clear a bit. Spitting out a few fragments of dirt, Norik pondered what to do next. Not once had he seen any wild animal other than a bird. Without a bow or slingshot, he had no chance to bring down one of the creatures. Yet, he needed food. His left hand suddenly moved without any regard as to his wishes. The fingers separated and bent inward, almost as if now Norik clutched an invisible sphere. The gauntleted hand then turned until the palm faced the landscape just before the stunned fighter. From his lips burst a single word. Jezrat! The ground a few feet ahead buckled. Norik at first thought that a tremor had struck the area, but only a small crevice, perhaps 6 feet by 3, actually formed. The rest of his surroundings did not so much as shiver in the slightest. His nose wrinkled as noxious fumes arose from the minute but apparently deep fissure. The air burned where yellowed tendrils of smoke spread. Iskari! Woyat! The new words came out of his own mouth with great ferocity. From within the fissure came a horrid, chattering sound. Norik sought to back up, but his feet would not move. The chattering increased, now a babble of high-pitched, animalistic sounds. Norik barely stifled a gasp as a grotesque, tusked face thrust itself, somewhat unwillingly, into the overcast day. A pair of jagged, curved horns rose from the top of the scaly head. Round, yellow orbs, with blazing red pupils shied away from the sky, finally focusing with clear bitterness on the human. The creature's squat, porcine nose twitched as if smelling something terrible, something that the fighter realized likely was him. Twin sets of 3-digited talons seized hold of the sides of the fissure as the horrific beast pushed itself up to the surface. Squat, oversized feet with curved nails planted themselves on the ground. Norik stared down at a thing surely out of the underworld, a vaguely humanoid, hunchbacked denizen of the depths, who, while barely reaching his waist, revealed surprising muscle under skin both scaled and furred. And then a second of the creatures joined the first. He immediately followed by a third, a fourth, a fifth. The frightful pack ceased growing in numbers after the 6th, a half a dozen more than Norik certainly desired. The demonic imps chattered in their incomprehensible language, obviously upset with being here, and very clear upon whom they blamed this entire situation. A few opened toothy maws and hissed at Norik, while others simply scowled. Jester! Iskari! The strange words once more startled him, but their effect on the monstrous pack proved even more astonishing. All signs of defiance faded abruptly as the imps groveled before him, some fairly burying themselves in the ground to prove how lowly they were. Dovru Sesti! Dovru Sesti! Whatever the phrase meant, it sent the horned brutes scurrying in outright panic. Squealing and chattering, they headed off in different directions as if their very lives depended upon it. Norik exhaled. Each time unknown words sprang from his lips, it felt as if his heart stopped. The language sounded akin to that used by Faustin and other Viserai, with whom the veteran had made acquaintance over the years, but it also sounded harsher, darker than anything Norik's murdered friend had ever spouted, even in the worst of battles. He had no time to think any more on the subject, for suddenly chattering arose in the distance. Norik peered to the south, saw two of the monstrosities loping back, the bloody, torn remains of a goat dragging behind them. He had been hungry, and now the suit provided him with its idea of sustenance. Norik blanched at the sight of the carcass. He had, of course, often slaughtered animals for food, but the imps had taken some delight in capturing and slaying the unfortunate goat. The head had nearly been ripped from the body, and the legs dangled as if all broken. A portion of the goat's flank had been torn away, the blood flowing from that massive wound, leaving a stream of crimson behind. The grotesque creatures dropped the animal in front of Norik, then backed away. Even as they did so, a third member of their pack returned, this one carrying a small, bloody carcass with vague similarities to a rabbit. Eyeing the grisly offerings, the wary veteran looked for anything he himself might still consider edible. Exceptional hunters the tusked beasts might be, but their handling left much to be desired. The other three imps returned within moments, each bearing their own prizes. One, a tattered-looking lizard, Norik immediately dismissed. The others, a pair of rabbits, he finally chose in preference to what had been first given to him. As he reached for them, his left hand again rebelled. The gauntlet passed over the rabbits, and as it did, incredible heat threatened to sear Norik's fingers. "Damn you!" He managed to stumble back a step. The heat faded quickly again, but his hand still throbbed from the near burning. From where they gathered, the imps chattered, this time sounding quite amused at his discomfort. However, a quick and furious glance silenced them. His hand nearly normal again, Norik returned his attention to the rabbits, and found them completely cooked. The scent that arose from them even smelled of certain spices, all enticing. "So, don't think I'm going to thank you for this," he muttered to no one in particular. Hunger overtaking his good sense, the graying warrior tore into the surprisingly well-prepared meat. He devoured not only one, but both rabbits with great ease. Large, they eventually silenced the cry in his stomach, leaving him to ponder what to do with the rest. Norik waited, expecting the suit to make the decision for him, but nothing happened. The pack still watched him, but their gazes often slipped to the meat, finally giving Norik his own answer. He raised his hand, indicated the goat and the other slaughtered creatures, and waved toward the imps. They needed no further invitation. With a manic glee that made the seasoned veteran push away, the tiny horde fell upon the meat. They tore into the flesh, sending gobbets and blood flying everywhere. Norik's own meal grew queasy in his stomach as he watched the demons strip the bones of anything they could devour. He imagined those same claws and teeth on him. "Verash!" So disturbed by the sight before him, Norik barely reacted to the harsh word bursting from his mouth. The imps recoiled as if struck. Cowed, they seized what remained of the goat's carcass and dragged it toward the fissure. With some effort, the grotesque creatures deposited the remains in the crevice, then one by one followed after it. The last gave the human a quick and highly curious glance, then vanished into the bowels of the earth. Before Norik's wondering eyes, the crevice sealed itself, leaving no trace of its existence. Walking dead. Haunted armor. Demons from the underworld. Norik had witnessed magic in the past, even heard tales of dark creatures, but nothing could have ever prepared him for all that had happened since he had first entered that cave. He wished that he could go back and change events, make the decision to leave the tomb before the Guardians had